still have interest there. They're still flowing. Can you imagine that?
How many years has it been?
Huh?
How many years has that been?
Oh, God, that's in 31, 52 or 3 years. The well's still flowing. We were in the Castleberry survey. I don't know whether you've ever heard of the Castleberry, but that's where the thickest sand was, maybe 120 feet. And the Woodbine is a very wonderful sand in that it's round grain, no cementing in there. And when the round grains store a lot more oil per acre than angular grains. So it's just got a lot of oil in it.
Bob Forey is an independent oil man who worked in the East Texas oil field, which, when it was discovered in 1930, was the largest known oil field in the world. While the rest of the country was mired in the middle of an economic depression, East Texas was a land of riches. People streamed toward the field looking for work, and the tiny town of Kilgore turned into a boom town overnight.
Not only was East Texas exciting and it promised a lot of action and activity and people came there for that reason, but it also offered an economic chance when there were very few chances elsewhere.
Moreover, typically in any oil boom, there's an initial advantage to workers who get there quickly because there is always more demand than supply. And that always set loose a great rush to these oil fields of people in more mature fields where wages were lower. So you add that to East Texas, and you have all of the ingredients for a massive oil boom. Not an ordinary garden variety Texas-Oklahoma boom, but really one of massive proportions.
Catherine Brown, a longtime resident of Kilgore, first arrived in the boom period. Some of the older pioneers didn't appreciate the boomers, as the newcomers were called.
It was bedlam. That's the only way I can express it. There were thousands of people in a little bitty town with no place for anybody to stay. And when I first came over, I stayed 2 nights. And we had an awfully hard time finding a place to stay because my husband was busy as he could be. They were drilling, and he was watching the drilling operations and everything, and they were scattered. And so we finally found, someone told us that this elderly woman had rooms, and we went to her house, and she looked at us. We told her we wanted a room for a night or two. She said, "Are you married?" And we told her, yes, we were married. And she said, "Do you have your marriage certificate with you?" And we told her, no, we didn't have. She said, "Well, I don't take nobody while they ain't got their marriage certificate with them." And we found out later that she was just taking men, that she didn't want women in her house anyway. But that was the attitude that the old-timers had toward us. They thought we were all just wild and woolly people.
Roy Fuel left Dallas with a nickel in his pocket and headed for the East Texas oil field, where he got a job with Magnolia Oil Company stringing pipe.
The little East Texas town, Kilgore, was just a very small town, and not a whole lot of people, mostly all from the oil boom. Even though the field hadn't been operating long, there was a lot of people down through the woods. In my job, seeking out places to get trucks into the line, I run into a lot of different people, and I could find places out where people just pulled pine branches down and made them bed to sleep in the night before. And they were very primitive because there wasn't anybody, the workers wasn't making money. $4 a day wasn't much money. This kind of work had always paid around $20 a day. But being as it was Depression time, see, they was making the best of it. And whatever they could get you to work for, you did. I was glad to get $4 a day. I wouldn't make it anything in Dallas.
Despite the low pay, the flood of people and oil continued. By the summer of 1931, the drilling activity was proceeding at an incredible rate.
The pace was on so feverish and fast that by October of 31, the next year, it's estimated that a well was being brought in every 24 hours in the East Texas field. It wasn't long until there were 24,000 wells drilled, and they had more coming. And
there was a gas pressure under that oil that lifted it. It didn't have to go to the expense of pumping it up. And they flared the gas. It wasn't any sale for it. It burned it. At night, my home was at Chandler, where I was reared, about 40 miles west of there. I've gone up home to see my parents during that time, working here in Austin in the Attorney General's office under Jimmy Allred. When you got 40 or 50 miles west of the East Texas oil field, it was ended up 42 miles long and 4 to 8 miles wide, with tens of thousands of wells, all burning that gas, flaring the gas to bring the oil up. And as you looked out over the horizon, you could see a strip about 50 miles where it was light at night up into the sky. Not flashing like a fire burning, steady white light, not dancing like the aurora borealis.
The pace was actually too fast for the health of the field. The field was being rapidly drained. Calls came from the major oil companies to regulate the field, either voluntarily or by governmental mandate. But independents owned most of the field, and they claimed the need to produce rapidly in order to economically survive. The major oil companies had missed out on the field because the discovery was an accident. Dad Joyner, who found the field, was working in land that the major oil companies had discarded. Joyner may have been as surprised as anybody else at the discovery, according to another independent oil man, J.R. Parton.
That he was a great success drilling dry holes. Once he found a great oil field, went broke. Of course, H.L. Hunt traded him out of it. But he caused all the trouble. He sold a lot of leases to. He sold parts of leases, sometimes whole leases, to several different people. And he was in trouble, all right, on his title business, and H.L. Hunt took advantage of that. And for $25,000, which H.L. Hunt borrowed from a haberdasher and a friend of his in El Dorado, Arkansas, Pete Lake, he bought all that property. And that's why H.L. Hunt got an oil business.
The East Texas field was located in a new geological formation, and so the major oil companies discounted the discovery until December 1930, when the second discovery well came in. The Ludella Crim No. 1 was a major event in the history of Kilgore. Foster Bean, then a young lawyer, but later the mayor of Kilgore for 14 years, was there and still remembers the excitement.
It was on Sunday morning. There was a good crowd, I would say between 50 and 100 people. Everyone knew that they were going to test it. Of course, I don't think anybody was sure whether it would be oil or not, but they knew that the well was supposed to come in that day, and that's the reason they gathered out there. They let the well flow out to the side, and of course, it had a tremendous gas pressure, and I assume that stream of oil shot out of the well about maybe 100 yards.
When a third well was discovered 10 miles away, it was clear that the East Texas field was of colossal proportions. It eventually turned out to be 40 miles long and 5 to 10 miles wide. Because the majors had held back on leasing, small independent oil men leased 80% of the acreage. The pace of drilling increased rapidly, and the resulting population increase from 700 to 7,000 overnight permanently changed Kilgore.
Was the Kilgore boom unique in any way?
Well, yeah, the drilling right uptown, and the mud. Of course, the mud's always there, was always there. But yeah, it was different in that you know they drilled wells right up through the town. So there was a lot of activity there in town more than a normal oil field would be. Most of the time, the oil field's out yonder.
When the oil wells went in, most of the downtown part was across the railroad from where it is now. But there were 2 or 3 stores on this side, on the east side of the railroad, and then they built several new buildings in there because of course, the town started growing and people started getting the oil money. And they built them, some of them went all the way through the block, and they'd have a back door and a front door. Well, they would, when they found out there was rich oil sand under the town, the actual town, they would go in and cut off half of a building and wall it up and drill a well there. And the richest acre, every one of those buildings were cut back and oil wells drilled in there where they were. And the wells were so close together that if one man owned 2 wells, he only had one jack, and he had a well pumping on either end of it.
Well, as I said, I came to work on Monday morning. The town was full of people. The sidewalks were full. And I'll have you to know that it's been that way ever since. I mean, during the boom days. And the boom days lasted for some 10 or 15 or 20 years. The streets were crowded. Nobody knew who you were, and nobody knew who I am, and I didn't know who anybody else was. Everybody was strangers.
The presence of a large number of young men earning high wages really acted like a magnet to attract prostitutes and gamblers and so on.
There's another thing, too, about a large quantity of young men. Of course, large quantity of young men are not going to behave like a large group of matrons in their 70s at a tea party at the country club. They can be pretty rowdy. And so they gave oil towns, boom towns, a very rowdy kind of rough and burly character. Whether these places were really very dangerous is debatable. A lot of the disturbances that took place in boom towns were drunken, disorderly, brawling in the street, things like this, the sort of thing you'd expect in a large quantity of young population.
Jody Hughes' teaming camp was in Pistol Hill. And it was a wild and woolly place. Most of those teamsters were rugged men, I'll tell you. And they didn't have any regard for life or life of an animal or anything else. And they would have a big gamble in their mess hall on Saturday nights. And they always had fights, and usually before it was over with, somebody was killed, and we always said that if nobody was killed in the Jody Hughes camp on Saturday night, the sheriff came out on Sunday morning to see why. Because it was just that rough.
It became so chaotic that the Texas Rangers were sent in, or rather one Texas Ranger was sent in, Captain M.T. Lone Wolf Gonzalez, also known as Two Gun Gonzalez because of the 2 pearl-handle pistols that he always wore. The stories about Lone Wolf still circulate today.
Oh, let me give you just one instance. I never personally saw the gentleman. It was more or less of a fictional individual at the time it grew. He would walk down Main Street, and he would stop an individual who would be suspect and ask to look at their hands. And if their hands were smooth, they didn't belong in the oil field, and he would put them on the next train out of town. The hands wouldn't be rough, like a roughneck. The story is told, and was told to me by the gentleman who happened to be a rather prominent merchant in this town, and he was stopped by Gonzalez, and so he took him to a store where he had all of these people on the floor and handcuffed, getting ready to ship them out of town, and this fellow pleaded that he was not one of those. He was a merchant, and it took quite a bit of doing for him to get someone to run to the bank, to get the bank president to come down to identify him as not being one of the thugs.
Well, he turned the churches into jails. But when he ran out of space, he ran big, heavy chains between trees and handcuffed these men to these chains. And that was the way he kept them from getting out and stealing. You've no idea of the vandalism and the stealing and everything. People were hungry. And people who had stores just had to watch because anything would be stolen. Some people would steal to sell, and others would steal because they really needed it. And so Gonzalez put a big stop to that.
The boomtown atmosphere led not only to civil strife, but to economic strife as well, as producers pumped oil so fast that the price fell to $0.10 a barrel. There were 40,000 wells in the field, and hot oil, as illegally produced oil was called, was a major problem. Bill Murray, a railroad commissioner in the 1950s, was an investigator in the field in the 1930s.
There was a sort of a Robin Hood philosophy that the oil belongs to everybody. And the bad old big companies on the fortunate enough on the east side are going to recover a whole lot more oil than they had in place. So what's it matter if I wouldn't steal from my neighbor, but if I steal from the field as a whole, that's all right. So it became sort of a community philosophy that running hot oil wasn't really bad.
No one can really describe all the different ways that hot oil boys got oil out of the field. Of course, the favorite trick was what was known as the bypass. And the bypass was merely a series of complicated piping so that you never knew where the oil was coming from or from what wells it was coming from. People adopted all sorts of devices. One of the funniest ones, of course, was something called the Fortress of Gladewater. And here, a man had built a concrete blockhouse over his well and attached it to his residence. And his claim was that his house was his castle, and therefore no representative of the Texas Railroad Commission or the feds either were entitled to go in and check the well. The hot oil lines were so many and so numerous, I don't believe to this day everybody knew where they were, and I'll bet there are a lot of them still up there, because nobody wanted to ever admit that he had anything to do with a hot oil line.
I know of one case where these people moved down from the Panhandle, from up close to Amarillo somewhere, and built just a little two-room shack. And they, after they built it across a pipeline. They knew that this pipeline was running across this land, but they built that, and everybody said, "Oh, that won't make any difference. Build that if you want to," the landowners. So they built where they wanted to. And this lady had beautiful rugs and a Cadillac and everything sitting out in front of this little old two-room shack. And they put these rugs down on her floor and cut well, before they put the rugs down, they cut a great big trap door. And then they went into these pipelines that were under there and set in valves so they could turn them on. And then they connected their own pipeline to it, which was, their tanks were way off down here somewhere. And whenever her husband would come in and say, "We need a 500-barrel tank of oil," well, they'd roll the rug back and lift up the trap door and turn on the valves. And he'd go and gauge the tanks, and when they had as much oil as he wanted, well, he'd come back and they'd turn the valves off. And sometimes she would do that herself. He would give her the high sign from wherever he was, and she'd turn them on or turn them off. And that actually happened. I know of that one case, and I know that there must have been numbers of cases that were just very similar to that.
How did they get caught?
Well, if they ever got caught, I don't know it. That was before people suspected that there was all that sort of crooked work going on. And this one particular family, I'm sure, were never caught.
How did you know?
How did I know? She and I were real good friends.
East Texas was the holding of the small farmer. There were holdings there that dated back to the 40-acre and a mule freedmen's bureaus of Reconstruction days, for example. So it just wasn't possible for major companies to go into East Texas and lease up the moon as they had done in other parts of the country. That, in turn, meant that it was easy for small independents to get in with very limited capital stakes and become active in the field immediately.
And there's another attraction for independents as well. The oil that was found in East Texas was found at a relatively shallow depth, and you could drill for it without any major problems. There were no high-pressure gas formations. There were no tricky water formations. Your overhead could be very low because it was shallow enough so that you could use an old-fashioned wooden rig made from timber right around your area. You could get a crew to build this. Labor costs were incredibly low because the Depression was on and people were looking for work. So when you put this all together, you came up with a place where an operator could drill a well The average well could be drilled in 1931 for about $15,000, and many were drilled for as little as $9,000. In return, you got a huge quantity of oil. Well, you don't have to have a very high price on your oil before you're going to get a really good return on this. And so from an independence point of view, it was manna from heaven, because here was a place where you could expect to find a tremendous quantity of oil at very, very low costs. And that's the one thing that could beat a situation where prices were falling steadily.
The overproduction and resulting waste led Governor Ross Sterling to declare martial law in order to halt the economic catastrophe. But it was simply too difficult to enforce quotas by force. The declaration of martial law for economic riots was eventually declared unconstitutional. But before that happened, Ralph Yarborough was sent to East Texas to oversee the law.
Jimmy Allred called me in the office and said, Ralph, my oil and gas lawyers in Washington, Carl Estes, he was a dynamic editor of the Tyler Courier-Times, known all over the state for being explosive and dynamic and militant. He says he's called demanding. I've got to have a lawyer over there. We've got to do something. That hot oil's about to break the whole country. And says, I want you to go over to Tyler, go over and get the fastest conveyance out of here. Go to Tyler, go to Tyler Courier-Times, and report in to Carl Estes. I've sent you over there to do something about it. Well, I got there, I'll never forget it, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Carl Estes editor sat in the front office, but he had a sliding window right behind him, wooden, that you can't see through, right into his press room. He could just raise that up and turn hollow orders into the press room. The reason he had those big headlines every day, he'd change it if something happened. I got in and introduced myself. He's talking to people, and asked, what's your name? I told him, Ralph Yarborough. And who? Assistant Attorney General. I said, yes. Attorney General Allred told me to report to you when I got here. He turned and raised that window and whirled his head and said, stop the presses, stop the presses. He screamed. It was about 4 in the afternoon. They stopped the presses. Says, you're Ralph Yarborough, Assistant Attorney General? Says, stop, and said, put that in there, that's what he said. And he says, and General Allred sent you over here to stop this running of hot oil? Says, and he turned, General Allred sent him over here to stop this running. Says, and you're going to bust the backsides of these jails out of these fellows if they don't stop it? That's what he said. I was interviewed. I never said a word during that interview. I'll just tell you part of it. He was full of fire. Well, the next day, I went with some Railroad Commission men while the court had held the martial law unconstitutional. The National Guard was still around. Saw a couple of National Guardsmen sitting on a tank, and I was with some people working for the Railroad Commission. I said, what do you think about this National Guard around? One of them turned around and he said, you know, if I was running hot oil over here, I'd want some of those soldiers sitting on top of every one of my tanks because they don't know what's happening down there, and nobody'd bother you. The soldiers sitting up there, they'd know you're legal. And so that's the way the regulators thought about the National Guard trying to stop the running of hot oil.
It became necessary for the state of Texas to think about proration. It became necessary for the operators to think seriously about proration. And there was born a big fight over the question of proration and how the rules were to be written. Practically everybody agreed that we had to have proration, but there wasn't any sort of an agreement that was acceptable on just how to do it. And one wave of operators wanted to just base everything on acres, and but the old and historical way of judging an oil well and rating an oil well is on the basis of its potential. Its potential, its deliverability.
The need to control the production from the East Texas oil field led to a national law in 1935, the Conley Hot Oil Act. That set the pattern for regulation of oil for the next 40 years. Every state had a quota and every well had an allowance. The East Texas field was a prototype in a number of ways.
There are many things about the East Texas field. It was, when discovered, the world's largest oil field. It was of immense importance during the Depression years. It has been of tremendous importance in subsequent years. I'm tempted to discuss those things. Perhaps that will be better covered by others, the tremendous economic importance. And I would focus instead on the tremendous strides forward made during the early life of the East Texas field in improved conservation for that field, and also it served as the prototype for similar fields all over the world. That field is studied even today all over the world for the progress we made in conservation.
The system of regulation and quotas that was put into place in the 1930s continues to give rise to conflicting opinions.
Then the Railroad Commission took over and set the allowables so that everybody got a fair share. Because the big ones, they eat the little ones up if they didn't have a fair shake. Because they got too much power to do things that you can't do. For instance, like building a pipeline in there, moving it to their refinery. You only sell what they'll buy, and the price is what they say it is. So without it, you would have been a little one would have got run over. No, it saved the day for the little operator.
Well, the proration laws had their effect. The small refineries had to fold because of that law is required that they keep records of every barrel they bought and who they bought it from and what they paid for it, and that folded them. And by 1938, 7 years after the field had really begun to explode, it had changed where in 1931, 80% of the total acreage is some 157,000 acres in the field, 245 square miles, bigger than some of the small counties of Texas. But by 1938, in 7 years, 80% of all the acreage in the field was owned by the major companies. It had turned around. And they perceived that Sterling was a representative of the major companies in turning that around, and they wanted it a free enterprise. Every man, they followed the old American motto, every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost. That was the philosophy of the East Texas oil field.
Cider, sweet as apple cider, sweeter than all I know. Come out in the silvery moonlight, our love will whisper so soft and low. Seems though I can't live without you. Listen, oh honeydew, oh Ida, I idolize you. I love you, Ida, love you, did I do?